Hey, ever get frustrated trying to repair a piece of jewelry? Well, I'm here to help. You get the picture. Someone brings you in a piece of jewelry to repair, and you're thinking, can I do it? Can I bring it back the way it was? Can I make it better? My name is Warren Feld, and I've been designing jewelry and doing jewelry repairs for over 38 years now. And here I brought my jewelry designer's Fix-It Toolbox for you, and I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to show you how I would approach this particular repair. So let's look at our next repair. This next piece that the customer wanted to have repaired is a 3-strand stretchy bracelet. 2 of the strands, the elastic broke, and the customer doesn't want it redone on elastic. Instead, she wants me to redo this on cable wire using a clasp. The better designer is someone who really understands how to leverage the strengths of materials and techniques and how to minimize their weaknesses. And so I'm going to sort of make references to that as I get into more detail. But in general, we have 4 design issues that we need to find some resolution, or that good balance between strengths and weaknesses. One is stringing materials, the second is the clasp, third is the layout, and the fourth is resizing. So here are the broken pieces as they came to me. You can see that the 2 strands just have the loose beads, and we have 1 strand left remaining on the of the bracelet, and I have this sitting next to a bead board. The first step is just try to see if I can recreate some sense of what it may have looked like. And here I've laid out the loose beads, which were the 1st and 3rd strands, on a bead board to give myself a sort of a starting point. And so here I've laid out the 3rd strand and put the jade centerpiece in the middle. Above in the tray of the bead board, you'll see some loose pearls. I didn't include the pearls here because I didn't want to use them. I thought they looked cheap and a little out of place. So my next step is to actually design the layout the way I want to see it and the way I think is going to look the best. So I need to determine which beads, because I'm going to have to delete some beads, since when I add a clasp, the clasp assembly is going to take up some volume that wasn't a part of the elastic stretchy bracelet. I need to distribute the sizes of the beads and the shapes of the beads and the colors of the beads in some way. And I need to make a decision about how much I want to deviate from the original. So the client is expecting one look, and I'm already going to give her a slightly different look, and I want it to be more appealing, somehow better, without knowing a whole lot about the client. But I hope I have a high enough level of taste that'll work itself out. So I've begun to redesign the piece, and the first thing I have to do, the jade centerpiece has large holes, so I need to plug them. I don't want to put small beads there that'll get swallowed by these holes in the centerpiece. So I've taken some of those 8mm round black diamond colored glass beads and put them on either side of where the holes are in the jade centerpiece. And I also wanted to bring that gray color into all 3 strands, not just in the center strand, to make the piece have a little bit more coherence and cohesiveness. I've taken some of the other beads, which are either glass or actually plastic, and I've tried to match them on the inner string on the left with the outer string on the right. So you can see like the 2 brighter red ones in that position, the top left and the bottom right. And I'm building out that sort of sense of symmetry, but give it variation, so not everything is in the same strand in terms of repetition, and give it that kind of look. And then of course in my mind I'm always trying to keep in mind the final size that I'm going to need. So again, I'm getting a little further with the design, and you can see I'm still working that idea of symmetry, pairing. I want a sense of balance, but I want some unexpectedness, so that's why I work the inner strand slightly different than the outer strand. Slightly different, not too different, but slightly different, to give it more interest. And again, I keep that final size, that length in mind. So here I have the first draft of my layout design, and now I have to deal with issues of resizing, choosing a clasp, attaching the clasp, testing the size, retesting, making adjustments, and that kind of process, a little bit of back and forth. The original bracelet was strung on elastic string, and elastic string is really not a durable string material. Elastic string just lasts about 2 to 3 years before it breaks. You can see the sort of the back image of what the elastic string looked like before I took the beads off. It's sort of brown and deteriorating. I could replace it as is, and it would break eventually again in 2 to 3 years, or we could put it on something more durable, which is a cable wire. And with a cable wire, you need a clasp, so the clasp can be a little awkward to get on and off in a big bracelet like this, especially with a woman with such a small wrist. Cable wires are wires that are braided together and encased in nylon. And I only recommend 2 brands. One is Soft Flex, which you see in the picture, and the other brand is called Flex Right. And really I don't recommend any of the other brands. What makes the wire, it has to be strong and supple. It's got to move in a comfortable way as best as possible with wire. What makes the wire strong and supple is the ability of the nylon sheathing to maintain the twist in the wire. As soon as that nylon sheathing is violated, the wire immediately untwists and the wire breaks. And so with Soft Flex and Flex Right, the nylon sheathing is a good quality, it's thick, it's non-porous. You'll find a lot of other wires, the nylon sheathing is very porous, the air gets in, the wire breaks too easily. So again, I just suggest Soft Flex and Flex Right. And the thickness here of the wire that I'm using is 0.019 inches. 0.019 inches is a bracelet size. The issue for a bracelet is you want it to feel as comfortable as possible but still be as strong as possible, because bracelets get a huge beating when people wear them. I'd use something a little thinner for a necklace and something even thicker for something like an eyeglass leash. So I've strung each of the strands separately on separate pieces of cable wire. I like to have about 6 inches on each side of the bracelet part that's exposed cable wire, so I have something to grab my hands with. And here I've tied each end in a very loose knot so the beads don't slide off. So now I want to get some sort of first tries at the size. And remember, the original bracelet was 6.5 inches. The customer's wrist is very small, it's 5.25 inches. This is a wide bracelet with really big beads, and the wide bracelet is going to come up on her wrist, onto her arm, and it's important to pay attention to the customer, how the physical aspect of her wrist and arm are. A lot of people, it gets gradually bigger. On this particular customer, it's pretty much 5.25 inches up pretty far on her wrist. I'm going to take my strands and I'm going to fit them around what I call a bracelet sizing cone. And I need at least the middle and the third strand, the strand furthest up on her arm, to be 5.25 inches. Here's a wider shot of measuring the bracelet against the sizing cone. And a couple things you have to keep in mind. One, these are really big beads, so if I measured this length on a ruler, it's going to be much, much longer because the beads are bigger and they push out the bracelet from the wrist to get that same size as if they're compared to if these are smaller beads. So I'm going to have to anticipate that. I'm going to have to anticipate adding a clasp. And adding a clasp assembly, which is the clasp and all the little pieces needed to go from the clasp to the beadwork, the clasp assembly, is typically about 3/4 inch to 1 inch, and I'm going to anticipate that. And I know from experience that the cable wire has very little give, so the size that I come up with is pretty much going to be a relatively fixed size over the lifetime of the bracelet. For For some other string materials, when you're wearing them, they stretch a little bit, but not with the cable wire. So one last thing, when I met with the client, I asked her how loose she liked to wear her bracelets. Her wrist is really small, and most of her bracelets she wears very loosely anyway, and I had to take that into account in sizing. So some people like it very tight on the wrist, some people like it loose and to sort of get down a little bit more over the wrist. So that was an important consideration. We decided we wanted it to be a little bit loose. I want to talk a little bit about choosing a clasp for this piece. When we choose a clasp, you always have to visualize in your mind choosing the whole clasp assembly. That's all the other pieces that have to come together in order to attach your clasp to the beadwork, because the clasp itself might take up just a little space, but the whole clasp assembly might take up a lot of space, and there are issues of volume and appearance and strength and things you really have to think about. So it's always important to choose a clasp assembly, not just a clasp when you're looking at a clasp. So I'm going to again worry about the type of clasp, the look of the clasp, the durability of the clasp, how it can handle the weight of the beads, and how much space is going to be taken up on the bracelet for the whole clasp assembly. I don't want to end up with a clasp assembly bracelet. I want to end up with a bracelet with a clasp assembly. I discussed with the client different types of clasps and pros and cons, and it basically came down to sort of ease of use. So I suggested a lobster claw might be one possibility. It would be easy to use, but it visually won't be very appealing. Or a 3-strand push-pull clasp that visually would nicely complement the jade centerpiece, but would be a little bit more awkward to get on and off. She decided to go with the box clasp. So this is what that clasp looks like. It's important that the clasp be wide enough to match that the spacing of the 3 strands and the size of the filigree clasp. So really tall enough and then wide enough or narrow enough so it didn't compete. And given how small her wrist was, I didn't want that clasp assembly to be too large because it would detract from the beads in the centerpiece. And I was concerned that the clasp be strong enough that it could withstand the weight of the beads as well as the stresses and strains that comes from wearing your piece. So this particular clasp is very well made. The tongue that slides into the box locks in place very securely, and you really have to push down on that tongue to get it out because it's well locked in place. So I have my clasp. It's 2 parts on either side. There's a tongue on one side, the box on the other. And the clasp assembly is for a 3-strand clasp. We're going to use horseshoe wire protectors to cover the loops when we're attaching the cable wire through the rings on either end. We're going to secure the wire with crimp beads, and when we're got all the crimp beads crimped and crushed, we're going to cover them with crimp covers so that the ends look more finished. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to temporarily attach each side of the clasp to the 3 strands, and it's just temporarily because I may have to add or subtract beads based on how I resize it, test the size, and I try to make this as easy as possible. So I have a couple of things to do at this point. I want to make sure I get the sizing right. This might take a couple of different tries. I need to visually inspect it to see that it looks appealing, that I haven't left a bead out, haven't made a mistake somewhere, I hadn't crossed a wire. And then the last thing I do when I'm satisfied with the look and the size, I'm ready to actually crimp. Well, I measured the size and I felt I was a little short, so I needed to add some beads to this to really get it about 1 more quarter of an inch long. So at this point I removed one of the clasp parts on one side, So I took off the clasp and the crimp bead and the horseshoe wire protector. To get to that 1/4 inch, I decided to add some 2.5 millimeter sterling silver beads on either side. And one thing I really liked about this is that it tied the front of the piece visually to the back of the piece, which was the clasp, because the materials were the same, the color the same. Just made something even more balanced and harmonious and coherent. So I reattached the clasp that I had taken off, got everything tight and neat, visually inspected it, retested the size to make sure I ended up with that extra 1/4 inch, but not more or not less. And I'm ready to finish it off. I first feed the tails through at least one bead, ideally through several beads. In the best of all possible worlds, you never want to trim the tail right next to the crimp bead. In the best of all possible worlds, you want to be able to run it through at least one bead. And this gives you a little more leverage, makes it easier to get things a little tighter. And then I'm going to take a crimping pliers, and ideally, again, if you're going to do any kind of crimping, you want to get a crimping pliers. A crimping pliers has special notches in the jaws that helps you get through the 4 steps of the crimping process. So I have a crimp bead, I have the horseshoe wire protector. After I crush the crimp bead and reshape it a little bit, I'm going to slide a crimp cover over it to hide the crushed crimp, which looks a little bit ugly, make the end of the piece look more professional. At the end of this video, I have a link to a mini lesson on how to crimp if anyone is interested in pursuing that further. So basically 4 steps of crimping. I do the first 2 steps in what I call the bottom pair of notches on the pliers. One of those notches has a little triangle in it. That triangle is critical to the crimping process. In the first 2 steps, I'm basically taking my single tube and I'm forcing it into the shape of a double tube where the main wire goes through one side and the tail goes through the other. The 3rd step I do in the top pair of notches, and here I'm going to crush that crimp again over what is in effect a scoring line between the 2 sides of the double tube. It folds the crimp over in half. That creates a lock. And the 4th step, again, do in the top pair of notches. And here I want to reshape and tighten that crushed crimp so it looks a little bit more professional. Never really looks professional, and that's why I use crimp covers as well. And then I slide the crimp cover over it. So let's go ahead and look at the finished repair. So here we see the front view. See a little bit of the wire showing, but that's just going to be a part of the design when you're using the cable wire. But we get it as tight as we can. And here we have the back view. And the clasp assembly takes a little bit more volume than I would have preferred, but it'll have to make do. And you can notice the horseshoe wire protectors on each of the strands and how they connect to the clasp. This forces you to leave the ideal size loop. You never push a crimp all the way up to the clasp because this makes it too stiff and it can't respond and self-adjust to the forces of stresses and strains when someone's wearing the piece. So you always need to leave a loop. You can leave a bare loop, although a lot of people don't like that. The horseshoe wire protector makes the loop very finished looking, and it forces you to leave that ideal size loop to get you what I call the appropriate amount of jointedness. Again, at the end of this video, there's a link to my mini lesson on how to crimp if you want to pursue crimping in a little bit more detail, a little bit more explanation. Thank you. I'm Warren Feld, and I want to thank you for joining me today. You can find me on Instagram, or I strongly suggest you join my Jewelry Designers Hub on Patreon.com. There you'll find lots of great stuff to help you build your own Jewelry Designers Fix-It toolbox.